With Kingdom Come Deliverance 2's launch a mere week away, we're all about to get whisked away into the turbulent lands of the 15th century of Bohemia. Warhorse Studios has put a massive emphasis on historical accuracy and painstaking attention to detail in like everything. And in this video today, I want to take a dive into the history of the era of Kingdom Come Deliverance 2. We'll be taking a look at snippets from the prologue, and I'll be taking this all out of context, so it won't act as any kind of spoiler for those watching. You'll see stuff like freeze frames or small clips with little to no spoken words, just as much as I can to preserve your experience of the beginning of the game. Now, if you've been following along with the hype of KCD2 or Kingdom Come Deliverance 2, I want to be respectful of your time and inform you that you will find nothing new related to the gameplay or mechanics in this video. This is strictly me talking about history, so if none of that interests you, please feel free to shut the video down. Also, as it pertains to the history of what we'll be getting into, while I do know a ton of history, I am no historian with many scholastic accolades. Rather, I am an individual who had knights jousting as a wallpaper banner in his room growing up as a kid. That is to say that I have an obsessive knowledge of this era. So anything I touch on, I might gloss over certain points to make, or at least help make the information approachable, rather than getting lost in the sauce of explaining years of lineage for, one term, something like that. Feel free to correct me on anything you notice out of place, as I know a lot of history fanatics will be diving in on this game as well. If you've watched my Crusader Kings 3 streams, you know this is a very passionate time period for me. But you can navigate to any part of this video that interests you the most using the chapters in both the timeline and the description. And if you've not yet picked up Kingdom Come Deliverance 2 and you fully intend on doing so, you can pre-order or buy, depending on when you see this video, the game using my fanatical link in the description and pinned comment. It's 10% off right now through them. You'll get a Steam key, and I earn an 8% commission, so it's an awesome way to support the channel. Lastly, don't forget to check me out on Twitch, where I'll be doing a day one giveaway of the game on February 4th, linked below. But let's get started on my amateur historian's reaction to Kingdom Come Deliverance 2's prologue. So we're either going to jump into the game itself, or I have a bunch of clips that I've saved that we're going to talk about. And I figure in the pretense of looking like an amateur historian, nothing says business casual more than a short-sleeved Hawaiian shirt from Old Navy. Got this thing for like $13. Steal. So the game starts off with this opening shot, and we're going to jump to and from. Again, I don't want to show every little bit. We're going to take a look at certain portions. We're going to pause. We're going to talk about them and what have you, or I'll look at little snippets from individual portions of the steps further into the prologue. So we'll go ahead and press play here. And this is going to give us an idea of the era that we're in. So it's 1403. And I'll talk about this more in the equipment section, but 1403 is pretty important because we're coming into the midpoint. We're in now the beginning of the later portions of the Middle Ages, and things are going to start getting very different very fast. The 14 to 1500s is a pretty wild time. Things across the entirety of Europe are going to be changing quickly. The conventions of military, armor, weaponry, the way that knights in shining armor, the way that our armies work, all of it is going to change quite a bit, especially when you get to that midpoint around like 1454, 1450, around then, where most stuff kind of converts to like heavy plate armor and what have you. But 1403 is important because we're taking a look at the timeline of this video game. And Kingdom Come Deliverance 1 takes place just slightly before this, right? But Kingdom Come Deliverance 2, we're now talking about, we've always kind of talked about it, but it's the conflict between King Wenceslaus of Bohemia and the King of Hungary, which is King Sigismund. Both of these characters are very important characters, really the latter more than anything, because King Sigismund is a real important one. King Sigismund leads us through a lot of pretty crazy times, and he's one of the best monarchs of, I guess, I don't want to say early German history, but you have to remember that Germany at this time was not a unified land. Germany unifies itself in around 1871, and everything prior to that was either individual states or portions of the Holy Roman Empire. So when we look at King Sigismund, he becomes a real important character. He is the last of, almost the Merovingians. He's the last of the Luxembourg male line. There's no more male heirs. He's the very last one. A lot of the stuff that he brings to the table as a German monarch is stuff that we don't really see in a lot of the Holy Roman emperors since like the 11th or 12th century. So he has a pretty important stance in history. And this is all prior to the Hussite Wars, which is, that's a whole bag of bag of bones to get into, but I guess to kind of simplify it, the Hussites were a kind of like an Eastern Orthodox backed, Byzantine backed sect of Catholicism that was on the rise in the Holy Roman Empire. And Sigismund leads a pretty successful war against them in the Hussite Wars, which really kind of start the initial forays into that with Jan Hus start around this era. I think he's like 1401 to like 1412, something around then. So a lot of that was all kind of building in the background. And a lot of the conflict of the era too with King Wenceslaus is a lot of his basically losing control of the kingdom of Bohemia to Sigismund, who kind of uses that as a stepping stone into the unification and power of what eventually becomes a Holy Roman Emperorship for Sigismund. So we'll go ahead and press play here to step a little bit further forward to talk about another point, which is this bad boy, which brings us into gunpowder. Now, gunpowder is always seen as the thing that ends knights in the Middle Ages, and that's not necessarily true. It's like pike and shot is what really kind of ends things, because the pikes prevent knights from being able to charge into massed infantry formations. But we also look at gunpowder as a convention of the later portions of the Middle Ages, and really what starts the, I guess, military conventions of what becomes the Renaissance and what have you. The early modern era is what is typically called. And we see here a real kind of ramshod version of what eventually becomes a rifle, right? Where you basically hold this thing underneath your arm, you put your little firing, the fuse thing in there, and boom, it blows up and shoots. It's not even like a bullet. It's like a mini cannonball almost at your enemy. It's super inaccurate. But you have to remember that gunpowder itself had been around for hundreds of years, especially when we're taking a look at Chinese history. And even in the Middle Ages, we're looking at gunpowder coming in around the middle of the 12th century, so 1130s, 1140s, around that era. We look at the Battle of Crécy in France. They used cannons during that entire battle, which the French got obliterated by a better positioned British force. So gunpowder is something that has a very common misnomer around this time, especially as we take a look at how it really attributes to the downfall of the knight in shining armor, which is a term I'm going to just use a bunch of times throughout this entire video, because I'm using that term as it pertains to our imagery of what a knight was in this time. And I'll talk a little bit more about knights in just a little bit, but gunpowder was used, and it was very prevalent throughout this era, the era to come, and the era prior to it. You can't talk about gunpowder without talking about armor and the such. So you see this character right here. We'll pause right there. It's a pretty perfect one to stop on. What you're seeing here is a character who has quite a bit of armor on. And we're going to talk about this more when we talk about the equipment section. We see a chainmail coif or coif, and we'll talk about that again more. A rounded skull cap. We see some shoulder protection. We see the beginning of some van braces, some courtiers, as you can see around the right here, around the elbow. And then we see this suit right here. And this is a pretty important suit, because I think we think of knights as knights with plate armor on, or we think of knights as their proto version, which is what the Frankish knights were, or Charlemagne's paladins, which were individuals who were covered head to toe in chainmail. They would typically have what looked like a chainmail square here on their chest, but was actually able to be brought up and tied to their nose helm, which had a big metal nose piece here. So they were pretty much covered all the way up to here, and then chainmail down. In the 1400s, and really it's kind of the late 1300s that we start to see this more and more and more, is brigandine. Now, brigandine, whatever you ever want to pronounce it, brigandine, has these little rivets here. You can see those right there. And basically what this is it's usually a piece of leather, a piece of cloth, like almost like a gambeson, like a really nice thick piece of whatever that is stretched between two layers. And in between those layers are plates. That's what those individual rivets are. What's nice about brigandine is that it provides a lot of flexion, so you can move in different directions. You can move forward, you can move backwards. You have full articulation with your arms and armor. But what's nice about it too is if you were to say, let's say, just take an arrow to the chest at this point, and it hits one of those plates, it's very easy to replace that individual plate from a blacksmith versus having to hammer out a whole new breastplate. all sorts of things. Like if you take an axe to the top of that helmet, helmets too were curved like this to allow for blades to kind of swipe off them and not have purchase, versus like a flat great helm has purchase. That's why great helms eventually become sugarloaf. They have a big old like conical top at the top of them that allows for blows to kind of roll off them. The kettle helm over here is one that becomes extremely popular for any kind of man-at-arms or any kind of just kind of typical knight or a typical soldier. And Brigandine is nice too, because what you need to do on campaign is to be able to provide for your soldiers throughout the entirety of your campaign logistically. So if you have blacksmiths in your army, which you would have a whole, you almost would have the amount of soldiers you would have in your army, you'd almost have like double that in support. Either squires, people that would arm you, blacksmiths, foragers, whatever it is, you'd have a huge amount of people that would support the army, that would run alongside them, I mean, go alongside the whole entire army and provide that support. Blacksmiths could prefabricate a whole ton of these plates for all of the brig that was used across the entire army and then swap them in. This was done prevalently in Mongolian Golden Horde. They would have a ton of these little plates. Their lamellar or their brigandine armor would break in certain spots. It would take a stab, whatever it was, and they would be very easy to replace that individual plate, making the entire suit serviceable much faster in a campaign. So it's important to see this because it is a really important portion of arms and armor at that time. And it's cool to see it represented here in this game by a character who doesn't look like he's a knight. He looks like he's some sort of commander of a garrison guard or something of that sort. Doesn't look like he's necessarily a landed individual, as it were. So it's cool to see that jumps in right out the gate. And before we get into the complexities of a siege, you can't talk about one unless you're talking about a trebuchet. We'll see one in just a second, and it's coming up, I promise. The trebuchets are something that we always think of, right? When it comes to, right there. When it comes to any kind of medieval siege warfare. And conventions kind of, you think about it as something that was developed in France in the later portions of the Middle Ages, but you would actually be wrong. It's actually a Chinese invention that came about like in the 8th or 5th century BCE. It's a super old invention. And even then, the trebuchet was used in, again, the 1100s, just like we saw with gunpowder. So access to a trebuchet was something that they've had militarily in the Middle Ages for a longer than our kind of typical misconceptions would otherwise tell us. And when you take a look at the trebuchet too, you see this big, huge arm here. You've got, there's a specific name for this that holds the actual ammo of whatever it is. Sometimes it's a pot lit on fire. Sometimes it's an actual boulder, whatever it is. There's an actual name for that little guy right there. Then you have this counterweight. So there's two kinds of trebuchets. You have this large counterweight trebuchet, but the very first trebuchets were called traction trebuchets, meaning that you would either have one person, I'm sorry, not one person, you'd have one thing at the other end of it that would create traction in one direction, or you'd have a number of people pulling it to create that immediate traction and launching whatever that projectile was. And this, of course, evolved. Counterweight trebuchets actually derive more force. I can't even remember there's a famous mathematician or a physicist that came up with the convention that counterweight with weight moving directly down in one direction without shifting, this way or that way, allows for more force generation than, again, traction or something moving that can move laterally. So this generates more force to allow for more destruction of castle walls and what have you. And of course, there's gunpowder, there's cannons, and we're going to talk about siege warfare in just a little bit. But the trebuchets too are really cool because you can see this being used right here, but they're kind of a little bit more of like a shock and awe thing and less of like a drastically effective thing, which gets us into our conversation about sieges. So when we talk about sieges in the Middle Ages, you think of exactly what you're seeing here. Oh, the drawbridge, it has dropped. It's time to do a sortie, gentlemen, and we're gonna march across the drawbridge. We're gonna take arrows to the face. All sorts of stuff that you're seeing right now. Sieges, by and large, in the Middle Ages were extremely hard. And they were also almost always a failure. When you think of the term siege, you think of what you see right now. All these soldiers around the perimeter, trebuchets, ballistas, catapults, mangonels, which is kind of like a portion of like early mangonels and early traction trebuchets kind of fall in a weird little thing. Cannons, you think of like there's siege towers and all this stuff. While all those things are true, they were not always used, especially in the Middle Ages. This is a fort, which is different than a castle. So the successful siege of this is conceivable. Castles, by and large, were very impregnable. There's only a few recorded instances of a siege successfully breaching a castle and successfully winning the siege. Castles had many fallback points. Even if you were to destroy the walls and go to decide to breach through the walls, that was then a killing field. You were basically funneling all your soldiers through one little one little lane. So you had people that could shoot down. You had people that could be defending the breach themselves. It was hard to forge into that breach. So castles were not these things that were freely destroyed and broken into through these massive sieges where there's siege towers rolling down the way and so on and so forth. Even just the basic engineering of a castle, walking through the front gate, they were typically engineered so that as you would turn, going through the gate or coming down or up certain stairways, depending on where they were in the castle, are in the outer perimeter, are they in the keep, where are they? Your sword arm can't even come online because let's say I'm going to turn left. Well, most people at that time were right-handed. Like there's like a whole like wives' tale about being left-handed, making you a witch. But most people were right-handed. So the way that they would shape entryways into locations would make it so that your left hand would have to go through first and your right hand couldn't be the thing that would be able to allow you to get around to attack someone as you came around a corner. It would leave you undefended. Castles were brilliantly engineered through hundreds of years of engineering, starting with something as simple as the Motte and Bailey all the way back into like the 800s AD. So, well, like that's way earlier back actually, but still, either way. Thanks for that invention, Normans, when you came across and started making castles everywhere. But either way, castle sieges actually just lasted a long damn time. You as an advancing army could not afford to leave a castle unconquered or not dealt with. Because if you did, you left some sort of army at your back. And castles were there to slow armies down to provide support. And provide instruction out to, whoever the liege lord was, whatever it was. So, like, hey, we're being attacked. This is where the attack is. Bring soldiers. Basically, you just had to hold out in a castle long enough to enable it so that you could get relief. And castles grew over time. They went from keeps. We talked about Motte and Bailey's, right? Which is basically, you have the keep elevated above with a wooden, not fence, a wooden wall around it and a small palisade. But eventually, castles grow from being Mottes and Baileys to keeps to towers to then these grand, huge walled cities that make it so that you can almost indefinitely last through a siege because you have all of your crops and food and everything like that. Well, not really crops, but you have all of your food and stuffs within those walls. So sieges, especially in the 1400s, were something that took a long time. And on top of it, a lot of it was just sitting there waiting, sending notes back and forth, trying to negotiate. And oftentimes the tactic for the besieged was to use this as a delay tactic to hope that support came for you in time to break the siege, which it almost always did. Or you'd give up. It was one or the other. It was very rarely that you would actually have a successful armed siege going and actually doing something like this. But again, like I said, the distinction here that this is a fort. This is not a castle. So this was meant to kind of be a little bit more of a staging point that you could use to either bring troops to or bring troops away from and deal with something like this. But you could successfully siege it at the same time, especially with stuff like siege ladders, like we're going to see in just a little bit, which, well, in the next clip. You'll see them. You'll see siege ladders that'll make their way to the wall. But it was a lot easier to do that here with a fort versus a full-fledged castle. As you can say, like I said, you have your siege ladders making their way up. And this is, again, the prologue of the game. Don't worry, there are no spoilers here. I'm not going to show you something that's like, uh-oh, you just showed me that character's dead. No, it's not. It's just a little... This is just a little kind of precursor thing here. So we see one character who's gotten shot in the, where is it? Right here, with an arrow. And that would probably not be the case. Being covered in as much as you're covered in, especially it going through your mail collar, which would then be on top of some sort of, again, it'd be brigandine, it would be a chest piece, it would be something on top of a gambeson, or I'm sorry, on top of another piece of mail underneath on top of a gambeson. So this would be very unlikely unless, you know, the character had their arm up and they were to go right through their arm, whatever it is. And another point I wanted to bring up here is the use of crossbows. And we'll talk about this more in just a little bit too, but crossbows have a lot of varying use throughout the Middle Ages. It's not just simply that the crossbow came about and that ended knights in shining armor, the typical plate mail wearing knight. That's not the case, especially specifically the crossbows that they're using in this shot. The crossbows that go on to actually penetrate plate armor they had a little horn at the bottom, a little shoehorn, but basically you had to put your foot into it and you'd crank it and then you'd be able to shoot. And even then you still probably would not be able to penetrate plate armor. Plate armor too, and this isn't like a incorrect thing. I'm just trying to convey the history of this time. Plate armor too, you can see that there's a plate cuirass here used over what just simply looks like a gambeson. Perhaps there's something else underneath. You can use like a coat over your armor in this game. So that would, you know, obfuscate what's actually going on underneath all that. But the plate would be over the top. And another thing to reinforce the point of plate armor lasting into the later portions of the 15 and 1600s is that they would sometimes wear an additional piece of plate armor, and I can't remember the name off the top of my head, over that cuirass, which was steepled, just like this is right here, at a more drastic point. So it would allow for a shot to deflect off the sides of it, and it would be thicker in the center portion here than it would be on the sides, because you're less likely to take a shot from the sides than you are straight on. So a lot of the conventions of armor went with the times. The times didn't just completely shut things down. It wasn't like, oh man, I got this plate armor on and oh dude, a gun, this guy's got an Uzi and he just took out the whole entire army. Like, no, like I said, it took pike and shot to really take the teeth out of heavy cavalry charges. And even then, heavy cavalry charges were still used to some extent. And they ended up changing, especially as we get into that early modern era where cavalry charges stop becoming charges of heavy knights. They become like roundabout charges of like, not circadian rhythm. That's not the term I'm thinking of. Basically it's a big Cantabian circle where you'd have knights shooting with pistols that would then try to break apart the formations to then charge into them. There's a whole bunch of ways that heavy cavalry charges still maintained their relevancy even into the 1700s and 1800s, depending upon, and even the beginning of World War I with the Rough Riders and whatnot, used a lot of heavy cavalry charges. Cavalry still states, it sounds like I'm saying cavalry. I am saying cavalry. It's whatever my accent that causes people to think that I'm talking about the Holy Mount and not the actual mounted unit. But cavalry ends up still being a very big part of this era and many eras to come for military combat. And we're going to take a look at another clip here now. I'm moving over into another portion of the prologue with Hans here. We can see him kind of jousting about right there. And this shot's important. So Hans is an important character because he's actually a real live character. Is Jan Tasek? I'm not really sure how you'd pronounce it. I'm sorry. It's not a language of mine that I speak. But what's cool here about the historical accuracy of this game, this is actually his coat of arms. The actual coat of arms there is the same exact symbol that we see. And coat of arms is really important because heraldry plays a very big part in the entirety of the Middle Ages, but the conventions of it originally were used as a way to distinguish one side from another. We see the coats of arms in the Bayeux Tapestry with with the invasion of William the Conqueror into England, and then the establishment of the Norman dynasty, more or less, the Normans. And that's kind of some of the very first distinctions of some form of proto-heraldry or proto distinguishing factors. And again, that was used as a way to distinguish between factions. Like, okay, I know that everyone over here is on my side because I know that red swirl is what we're all doing, or the red checkers, or the black and yellow here, whatever it is. Those were originally used to just simply say, like, I'm on this team, like just simply with playing with your friends, like, oh yeah, blue versus red. That type of typical affectation was thrown into heraldry, which eventually became something that was representative of your house, your fiefdom, your duchy, your lordship, any what's it called? Not ranks. you prestiged through your lord. No, any marks of honor or prestige that were allotted to you through your lord. That's why you get a lot of different animals, or a lot of different tinctures, or a lot of different things on heraldry, because they were usually given to you as a recognition of your house, you individual, or what have you. And then men-at-arms, or people under your lordship, would have some variation of this heraldry present on their character. To sort of further my conversation on heraldry, we can see a lot of different stuff being used here in a lot of these. Basically, these are just simply guardsmen, more or less. They're not actual knights or anything like that. And that's a thing. Your heraldry was a personal distinction for yourself, or your family, or your house, or your lineage. There were layers to it. But when it came to these individuals within your service, as you could say, they might wear your livery, which is kind of a version of your heraldry, which matches the color scheme more or less. So you can see right here, these have horizontal stripes, which is often called a fess. And you have these kind of chevrons. There's a specific name for this zigzag pattern. It's like Harkenstock or something like that. I can't remember the specific name for it. But all these are charges, ordinaries is what it would be typically called on the actual heraldic seal you've got. And this livery, this representative of this maroon and white repeating motif, fits alongside the overall livery of that heraldry for, in this case, it's von Berghoff. But if we jump back over to Hans, who I think is somewhere in this clip, or here, we can see even more over there. But Hans over there, you can see he's got a lot more going on. And you have the different colors, which would mean different things. And stuff had a different name too. It wasn't just called green, it was called vert. You had a whole bunch of different colors. I think red is like Gules, Gules. Black was sable. So you had a bunch of different distinctions for these colors because they meant a bunch of different things. Like it meant, like one meant maybe you were like glorious or stuff like that. Or this eagle over here usually stood for nobility. And an eagle, or any kind of animal that you see on heraldry, is called a charge. As I check my note over here, yeah, it's called a charge. There's so many different names for a lot of things. Like again, there's like a tincture, there's all sorts of stuff. And that could also be like applied to like the metals used and the colors used. And you don't put colors on metals, you don't put metals on metals. There's a lot of rules for heraldry, and heraldry in and of itself is a big crazy thing of this time. But it also goes into the way that the armies were represented in the Middle Ages, which we hear about in a little bit. So I'm going to play this little portion here. Again, this is not going to spoil anything, to help you understand something. So let's press play.
How you greet visitors, my good man?
This is how we greet armed strangers when bandits are pillaging everywhere.
Can you not distinguish between a noble and a bandit, sir?
It's not always that straightforward these days. Who are you people?
So that's important, because this kind of goes into the conventions of warfare, loosely chivalry and stuff like that, but also banditry. We think of the word bandit, we think of, you know, a guy with an eye patch who's like, "Hey, you scum dogs, go give me your coin purse," you know, like something that sounds like an orc. But banditry at the time, depending if two nations were at war, sometimes the bandits or highwaymen were actually robber barons. They weren't just simply like, "Oh, you know what? I'm just some cutthroat on the road." No, I'm trying to interrupt supply lines, logistics. I'm deployed out over here to do these minor little conflicts to disrupt things. Sometimes, if you think of the 100 Years' War, the Trebuchets of the Black Prince of not Germany, the Black Prince of England. That's an example of kind of like banditry under the guise of military operations. And that's why in this exchange right here, this guy's not addressed as a noble from a non-noble. He's addressed as like, who the hell are you? We have bandits in these lands. And these bandits are seemingly noble, is what he's basically saying by that exchange right there. They seem like they are well-funded nobles attacking us, or a noble with men-at-arms and what have you. Which breaks down then the conventions of the military of a, well, typical middle-aged army. Middle-aged army. Just everyone's 45 plus and everyone's started to buy manual sports cars. Screw the insurance costs. No, armies in the Middle Ages were typically divided amongst three things. You have your lord with your house retinue, which usually was a bunch of knights. And then you have your men-at-arms, which were your knights and their men-at-arms and your men-at-arms as well if you were the lord. And then below that, you have a split between militia and mercenaries. Militia would be people, of course, recruited up, conscripted from your lands, all of your other nobles' lands, everyone pretty much your bannermen, like I said, with their militias brought to the fore alongside any armies that or any mercenaries that you could purchase into the military as well. So when we have these massive conflicts in the Middle Ages, we think of like, oh, it's 50,000 men killing 40,000 men or vice versa. Majority of them ended in routs because the militia and mercenaries would flee far before they would actually maintain a full, 60, 70% casualty loss. You'd have a big engagement. You'd lose 20 to 30% of whatever men on whatever side and whatever distinction or distinguishing factor, break apart. And then usually there would be a mass rout. And that mass rout would then, of course, lead to the next conflict. That's why you have in a lot of the longer wars of the eras, of the early, late, and the early, middle, and late Middle Ages, you have these conflicts that kind of, they have massive number amounts and they happen pretty quickly chronologically. Like, oh, here's a 50,000 on 50,000 fight. Then 4 months later, it's like 70K versus 80K. It's because of the mass rout. You would take all those soldiers, you'd bring them into the next army to do the next conflict. And the biggest portion of this would be capturing all of these knights and nobles and such. And I'll talk about this more in the equipment section that we're going to talk about next. But during these mass routs or in the midst of these conflicts, you would try to capture knights, bannermen, nobles, liege lords, whatever it is, because then this would turn off the accompanying men-at-arms, the accompanying militia, or at least it would greatly hinder them because they're the rallying force for whatever those are. So the Middle Age armies are not individual soldiers like you think of in Braveheart, where they're all unified under one individual who throws the banner at them. Like even a really good example of that would even be the conflicts from the battles in Braveheart, where by and large, William Wallace was a landed noble, a Scottish noble. These were massive militia armies, conscripted militia armies with professional soldiers leading like a 10% of that army. It was such a small percentage of soldiers that were actually part of the household or related to the household in some way, shape, or form versus the militia and the mercenaries. So your first time jumping into your inventory screen gives us a pretty cool indication of the way that armor, how it was worn, how it had to be approached in these times, in medieval times, of course. I don't even actually need glasses. This is fake. So the first thing here we're going to see is the padded, you might call it a coif. It's actually pronounced coif. So a padded coif. Now the coif was used in a lot of different ways. In this case, it's actually like a heavier type of cloth, like a linen, something like that, in the same way that the gambeson is made. So the game won't even let you, like if I take this off and go ahead and try to put on my kettle hat, it'll say, you know, you need equip padded protection in the coif slot, which is that guy right there. So we need to put this on and then the, put this on and then the helmet. And this was used in a lot of different ways. It wasn't just simply with metal helmets, but you could also put chainmail. Your chainmail would go over some sort of arming cap, is what it was also typically called. Some sort of just little tiny piece that would hold your hair in place, but also not hurt you if you put anything on over the top of it. Now, again, too, this is also represented with a lot of the other armor in the game. So if I go ahead and take off my chest piece here, and then I'll take off my plate mail, and we have our gambeson. If I go ahead and take the gambeson off, someone's showing some nipples, and I go ahead and put the hauberk on, it'll say you put on a gambeson first. It was the same thing here. And depending on what era, we're talking about the 15th century. So at this time, we would still have a heavy gambeson. But as we progress into the 16th centuries, into that later Middle Ages, where we start to see the increased prevalence of gunpowder, and there's not a false dichotomy. There's a false understanding of the fact that crossbows are what ended heavy armor. Crossbows were used the entirety of the Middle Ages and even before the Middle Ages. Crossbows did get varying levels of complexity. You have ones that actually you need to use the ground to properly wind up, and those had a stronger draw poundage and a stronger force of impact. So there's a common misconception that when we start to progress into this era, crossbows are prevalent, and crossbows are what kills knights in shining armor, and we have gunpowder and that ends knights in shining armor. That's not really the case, and the game does a pretty good job of trying to display this. So the gambeson comes on first, and then we put the hauberk on over the top. Now, in the later portions of this era, like again, the 15th, 16th century, when we get into those late Middle Ages, gambesons start to get kind of cut down. They don't have this big, heavy quilted cloth along the entirety of the person. The chest piece tends to get thinned out. In lieu, the arms tend to not be quilted cloth. They start to become chainmail because now you're starting to deal with more plate mail. In the 1400s, you have this kind of weird breaking point between 1400, 1450, and 1500, where armor goes from being, oh, okay, I have access to it. It's a lot of chainmail, it's a lot of brigandine, it's a lot of lamellar, into a lot of Milanese and German reproduced plate armor that becomes a lot of the staying force of your medieval knight. Now, remember too, knights are not men at arms. They're different socioeconomic, but also different accompaniment of armament. And also too, as we start to progress from the 14, 15, and 1600s, we start to go from individually supplied soldiers, men at arms and knights, into things that are actually provided by the state. When we take a look, I think, oh man, I can't remember off the top of my head, it's like 1500s when the Armory of England is established, where they mass produce stuff like arming swords, proper armor for the state's military, which is something that we hadn't had until since like the classic and antiquity era, where we start to have with the Roman Empire, right? The Roman Empire is a state-funded military, later at least, after the Marian Reformation. But again, gambeson has to be put on, and then we put on the chainmail. I guess it's the same way here too. I can put the brigandine over the gambeson too, and then that underneath. And brigandine too is a really important piece of armor that we've talked about as well. And it's the same thing here with our leg pieces. If I go over here to I put those over the top as well, our leg pieces, if I take off the hose, I can't just simply put them on. Put on some padded protection, foot protection first. So we put on the hose, and then we put on the leg armor, and just the same thing, we cannot put spurs on as well. And what you'll notice too is this leg armor, the back of it is exposed. This is another hallmark of this era as we progress into that later portion. Again, that it's like 1454 is that kind of traversal point between, hey, here's a lot of different articulating pieces of armor into pretty intense plate armor. This doesn't have a full protection across the back, because typically someone was on some sort of horseback. They wouldn't need it. They're sitting down. Whereas when we progress into a lot more of the full-on plate mail, stuff starts to get encased all the way around. There becomes chainmail in these portions. As you can see here, there's gaps in between this that still has chainmail there, but all that gets kind of shored up more or less. And what you cannot see necessarily very well is these little strips right here in this armor. Those are called folds, F-A-U-L-D-S. And they allow, and it depends too regionally where armor comes from, because that region depends upon the availability of horses and what knights were like in that area. Were they almost all mounted combatants, or did some of them get off their horses, where some of them didn't have access to wide amounts of horses for combat? Whatever the situation was, those folds were pretty much indicative of your area, because that meant that you had wider access to horses. So those folds were more prevalent in, say, France, where they had a large amount of mounted knights, versus England, which wasn't as true depending upon the time era. So folds allow the armor to articulate and push up as they're in the saddle of a horse. So you can see in just this simple little display here, before we actually even get into combat, you can see how much of this is very kind of accurate to the time, but also accurate to the methodology of putting things onto your character. You can't just simply put something on without another piece of protection underneath, because that piece of protection wasn't just simply cosmetic, it had a lot of ramifications behind it. And there's plenty of videos on the internet right now that show you like the difference between, I didn't even mean to do that. I slapped the keyboard on accident, but it panned out so well. But it shows how something like even a hauberk is extremely hard to penetrate, either through slashing or piercing. And the gambeson underneath, you have to remember that at the time, and I've reinforced this point a ton of times, at the time, knights were very rarely killed in combat. They were almost always incapacitated, taken as ransom, and then ransomed between nobles to try and get whatever money they could, because the amount of protection they wore was extremely effective. They were very impregnable, and they were also quite nimble, as you've probably seen through a number of other things that have debunked the myth that a knight in a shining armor and full plate was immobile. It wasn't the case. Just like, soldiers now train with heavy pack loads, a knight goes through their squireship into knighthood, training through increased amounts of load. People back then probably had to have a substantial amount of load on their person at all times to allow them to be quite nimble in the amount of armor. Even people that are like not conditioned to do it, jump into a full suit of armor, go, "Ooh, I'm pretty free moving in this bad boy right now." So that is our example here of how equipment really worked its way into this game pretty accurately from history. Now, coming into your character's first portrayal of combat here, we have a pretty interesting representation of combat. Now, all of what we have historically from Middle Ages combat is in reference to dueling guides in schools and whatnot. A lot of manuscripts that display, hey, here's how fighting was done. And you can see here, Hans is rotating through a lot of the different guards. Typically, and I'm someone who's certified in broadswords and rapiers have different defense methods and stances than broadswords do. This is typical longsword combat here. Longsword being kind of one of the typical armaments of what we would think of as a typical two-handed sword. As we've played so many RPGs, longswords tend to be one-handed. Back then, a longsword was more hand and a half, two-handed. An arming sword would be a typical one-handed sword. So you can see Hans move through all of these different guards. And I'll step back here, maybe you can get a representation of it. But in conventional combat, as far as like, when you look at combat throughout a bunch of different ways that you can access it now in our modern day, stuff like HEMA is a dueling way of doing combat, which is not a actual field combat, right? Where the point of HEMA is to make contact to score a point, versus field combat is to kill or maim or incapacitate. So a lot of the same rules coincide, and it depends upon what direction you're attacking. So the body is pretty much divided into, depending on how we're in the game, they truncate things down. But basically you have your lower left is your 1, your 2 was your lower right, then your 3 is just your standard left, then 4 is right, with 5 being up here, and then crossing it over would be a 6. So you have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. And that's basically the direction of the true edge of a sword. True edge being the sword pointing towards the enemy, and oftentimes the sword, the edge that is sharp, depending on the type of sword you have. False edge would be the edge pointing towards you. So you have a a lot of really crazy things as you progress through history of stuff like false edge attacks and false edge blocking. And we think of a sword in combat as the true edge hits the enemy and we hit them. And when you watch a lot of movies, you're watching stage combat, which is that reinforcement of 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. And if you're looking at like a rapier has like supinated and pronated grips of 6, 6A, and what have you. So looking at the way that you can see Hans moving around when he has his guard up really high over there. If you've watched Kingdom of Heaven talks about that exact defensive method. But that 1 and 2 in this video game is truncated just down to this bottom attack section, right? So if I press left click, I do a stab forward. Then 3 and 4 is whenever you're watching a movie, like if you go, now that you know this, it's probably gonna piss you off. Assume this is a sword. The pen is muddier. Fucking dumb joke. So 3 and 4, 3 and 4. Every time you watch a movie, this is what happens in the movies. 3, 4, 3, 4. They block to 3, they attack to 4. They block to 4, they attack to 3, one or the other. And then sometimes you have the quillins on a sword, right? Those are the things that splay out from the handle, with the grip. Quillins in modern or within the combat of the era were often used a lot of the time, They were used a lot of the time. You would take your weapon. Sometimes you would hold it like this with the false edge in your hand over here, and you'd have your grip. The blade would come down. You would use your quillins to snake the blade down and away from you, then use the hilt to bash into their face. A sword was not typically used by simply slashing at a target. And like I've said before, plate mail is not going to be slashed open by a sword, but instead you can inflict blunt force trauma. What would typically be done would be the tip of the sword would be used to either deflect the blade and quickly put it into the weak points of armor, or it would be used to knock someone into a point where they fell over. You could pull your dagger out and stab them in the throat, all sorts of things. The sword was not necessarily used as a means of killing another knight. It was used in dueling, in combat as a way to cut through other men-at-arms that had lower defensive qualities, or killing any of the mercenaries or militia, which we talked about. It was a large portion of Middle Ages armies. So the sword is a pretty interesting one. And again, here we've truncated 3 and 4 into a stab. I'm sorry, 1 and 2 into a stab. 3 and 4 still exist right here through left and right here. And the characters, they switch their hands, which is really cool. And then 5 and 6 have come to this same top section. So if I go ahead and attack on the 5, you can see how he blocks. And I think if I do it again, yeah, he always will block to the same 5 more or less, right? I'll attack to 6, he blocks to 5, or attack to 5, he blocks. He won't block like that, which is crossed over. And what you would also kind of think about when you're looking at a lot of this combat in the game is, okay, I was like, what is he gonna make me do right now? When you look at a lot of combat in this game, it's very fluid, because the way that combat worked in this era is you would use the direction of your blade to direct the energy of your opponent. So if, again, I've used this distinction, right, for a 6, that it's a hanging defense, meaning if I'm standing here, my blade's like this, more or less. As you would strike it, the blade would slide off, which would give me the ability to step around and hit you. So it's very interesting to see how this is brought into the game, because on this level, it's very rudimentary. I don't want to spoil more of how combat progresses. Those that have played Kingdom Come Deliverance know how combat does progress through the game and how it does get a lot more complex. And there's a lot more complexity here too. And it's nice to see how this is represented, because it's very true to form to the way that combat worked. I wish you could get a little bit more. I mean, there's a lot of really crazy stuff from a lot of those combat manuals where your forearm in a lot of duels was used to deflect blades, especially when it comes to the rapier. You'd have like a any kind of glove that just covers here is a glove. Anything that frays out from here is a gauntlet. So as you can see, the character in front of us has gauntleted gloves, correct? Because they have little splays. But with rapier combat, you'd use your forearm a lot of the time because it can't cut through that bone. A rapier's super deadly for stabbing, but it's not meant to like completely lacerate you. I mean, you can, but still. So in some of the Zweihander combat where they used, big, huge two-handed weapons, you'll see them using the tip of the blade to deflect an attack and use it to like whip around and disarm the opponent. There's something called, in rapier combat especially, you can still do this in a lot of other combats too. It's called a glissade, where you would take, if someone were to attack your 3, you'd take the blade, you'd ride it down their blade and whip it out. So there's a lot of things for the complexity of combat that we start to see in just the initial portions of this prologue. Whether or not this gets more diverse and more complex throughout the game is up for you to find out as you play through Kingdom Come Deliverance 2. At that, it brings our video here to a close. And there's a lot of things in this game. I didn't touch on nearly everything about all of the historical stuff that's prevalent. I just wanted to hit on a couple of things and just kind of debunk a lot of the typical misconceptions about this era, what's going on, and what have you. There's a ton of really amazing historical YouTubers that cover a lot of these subjects. So please go ahead and check them out. You can just type in like Kingdom Come Deliverance historical and you'll get tons of videos from people that are established historians, or established YouTube historians at least, going to a lot of the depth of the way the combat system works. So a lot of the depth of the way that this era is, all the little conventions, all the attention to detail when it comes to locations and where they kind of sat within the geopolitical climate of what was going on between both Bohemia and Hungary, and eventually the Holy Roman Empire. So a lot of really cool things are going to be happening in this game. And, if you're wondering yourself, well, how the fuck am I going to read all this stuff? In the game, there is a codex that goes through a lot of what I went through with you. There's a codex entry about the crossbow, which is called the Arma Diabli at the time, like the weapon of the devil, because it was considered unchivalrous, or unchivalrous to just fucking off a knight with a crossbow. There's codex entries about how the padded coif or the chainmail coif would undersit a helmet and all sorts of other actions. So there's a ton of this that exists within the game, plenty of it for you to read through. There's tons of ways that you can go through, lots of books that exist. So feel free to leave a comment if you want some more help. For those of you that are either historians or a fanatic such as myself, go ahead and respond to those comments. Let people know, hey, here's how you can crack into this information, read these books, what have you, so on and so forth. But I'm super excited to jump into the game with you guys come the 4th of February. I know I've been playing it, so I'll be releasing a review in due time. And also make sure you check me out on Twitch, as well as you can find a link to the Fanatical store below where you can purchase the game for 10% off. And I do get that 8% commission. So it's a great way to support the channel. But as always, guys, thank you so much for watching here today. Have a good one and take care.